The city was alive with its usual rhythm, horns blaring, heels tapping against polished sidewalks, and the endless hum of ambition in the air. In the heart of it all, towering glass buildings reflected the glow of a setting sun, each window a mirror of power, wealth, and relentless pursuit of success. Inside one of those buildings, Richard Caldwell, a CEO known for his ruthless efficiency and razor-sharp business mind, prepared to leave his office after another 14-hour day. His phone buzzed with reminders, his briefcase packed with contracts worth millions. For Richard, every minute had a price, and compassion was often too costly to afford. But as he stepped out onto the bustling sidewalk, something unexpected cut through the noise. A small voice, fragile, trembling, but filled with urgency, rose above the chaos. "Sir, can you help my mom?" Richard froze. The words didn't belong in his world of quarterly reports and board meetings. He turned, and there stood a little boy no older than 8, his clothes wrinkled, his shoes worn thin, and his eyes carrying a weight far beyond his years. The boy wasn't asking for pocket change. His voice carried a rawness that pierced through Richard's carefully built armor. The city's heartbeat seemed to fade, leaving only the silence of this unlikely encounter. And in that silence, Richard felt something he hadn't in years: a pull, a question, and a choice that would change everything. Because sometimes, the smallest voices carry the heaviest truths. Before we dive into this powerful story, ask yourself, what would you do if a child stopped you in your tracks and asked for help? Would you walk away, or would you listen, truly listen, to what could be a life-changing plea? Stay with me until the very end of this story, because what Richard discovered that evening will not only move your heart, but it will also make you rethink the way you see struggle, kindness, and second chances. And if you believe that even one small act of compassion can ripple into something far greater, then don't forget to subscribe, share this video, and join us as we bring stories that touch the soul and remind us of what truly matters. Rain tapped against the thin roof of a small, dimly lit apartment on the city's west side. Inside, the sound wasn't comforting. It was a reminder of leaks that dripped into bowls scattered across the floor. 8-year-old Ethan sat cross-legged on a worn rug, his schoolbook spread out in front of him, though he wasn't reading. His eyes kept drifting to the bedroom door, where he could hear his mother, Maria, coughing again. Maria had once been vibrant, the kind of mother who filled their tiny home with laughter and the smell of fresh-baked bread, even when times were hard. But ever since she lost her second job, her body had begun to give out under the strain of endless night shifts and skipped meals. She rarely smiled anymore. She worked every hour she could just to keep a roof over Ethan's head. Food had become a daily gamble. Some nights dinner was rice and nothing else. Other nights Ethan pretended he wasn't hungry just so his mother could eat. At school, his classmates whispered about his worn-out shoes, the ones with soles so thin the rain seeped right through. Ethan never complained, but each word, each laugh at his expense, cut deep. Yet it wasn't just hunger or the leaky roof that weighed on him. It was the fear. Ethan watched his mother's body grow weaker with every passing week. He saw her push herself to the breaking point, determined to hide the truth from him. But he was old enough to know she wasn't just tired. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. Late at night, when Maya thought he was asleep, she would sit by the window, her face illuminated by the glow of overdue bills. She whispered apologies to Ethan, words she thought he couldn't hear. "I'm sorry I can't give you more. I'm sorry this is the life I've given you." And Ethan, lying silently in bed, would bite his lip and clutch the blanket, wishing he could be stronger, wishing he could somehow take the weight off her shoulders. But the weight only grew heavier. Their landlord had left another warning notice at the door: 3 months behind on rent. The electricity had already been cut once that winter, and Ethan remembered the bone-chilling cold as they huddled together under every blanket they owned. That was the world Ethan lived in. A world where his mother was breaking in silence. A world where hope seemed out of reach. And yet, despite all of this, Ethan carried within him something rare: an unshakable love for his mother. He didn't want toys or new shoes. He didn't even wish for a warm meal every night. All he wanted was for his mom to be okay. It was this quiet desperation, this unspoken prayer, that finally pushed him to approach a stranger one fateful morning, clutching the only thing he still had left: courage. But Ethan had no idea that the stranger he was about to speak to wasn't just anyone. He was a man whose single decision could change everything. The winter morning was bitterly cold, the kind of day where even the air seemed to cut through worn coats and threadbare scarves. Ethan's shoes had holes in the soles, and each step on the icy sidewalk let in a sharp sting of cold water. Still, he pressed on, clutching his mother's scarf, a faded piece of cloth she had given him before he left that morning, as if it were his shield against the world. Inside the city's financial district, towering glass buildings reflected the pale sunlight. It was a world Ethan had only ever stared at from a distance. Men and women in pressed suits and polished shoes walked with purpose, their phones glued to their ears, their coffees in hand. Ethan, with his messy hair and oversized jacket, looked painfully out of place. But desperation doesn't care about appearances. It only cares about survival. He had heard from someone in the shelter that the people who worked in those buildings, executives, CEOs, bankers, had more money than they knew what to do with. Ethan didn't need millions. He didn't even need thousands. All he needed was enough for his mother's medicine. That thought alone gave him the courage to cross the invisible boundary between his world and theirs. At that very moment, Richard Caldwell, the CEO of Caldwell Industries, was stepping out of a sleek black car parked at the curb. Richard was the embodiment of success. Silver hair, sharp tailored suit, a face lined by years of ambition and deals that had built his empire. To him, this morning was like any other. Meetings, numbers, and the endless chase for more growth. But then it happened. Ethan, gathering every ounce of courage, darted forward. His small hand tugged gently but firmly on Richard's coat sleeve. Richard turned, startled, his brow furrowing as he looked down to see a boy no older than 10 staring up at him with wide, pleading eyes. "Sir, can you help my mom?" Ethan's voice cracked. His throat was dry, but his words carried a weight that cut sharper than any polished business deal Richard had ever faced. For a brief moment, Richard froze. Around them, the city moved on. Cars honked, people bustled, the air buzzed with its usual chaos. Yet, in that instant, everything seemed to stand still. Richard was a man used to negotiations worth millions, but never in his life had he been so disarmed by a single sentence. He looked at Ethan more closely now. The boy's cheeks were flushed from the cold, his fingers trembling, his eyes filled with something that wasn't just desperation. It was raw, unfiltered hope. Richard's driver leaned in, whispering, "Sir, we're running late." But Richard barely heard him. Something about Ethan's words echoed in his chest, pulling at a part of him he had long buried beneath boardroom battles and corporate victories. Memories of his own childhood, the struggles, the sacrifices, rushed back uninvited. For the first time in years, Richard Caldwell hesitated. And in that hesitation lay the beginning of a story neither he nor Ethan could have ever imagined. And just as Richard opened his mouth to respond, someone else suddenly stepped between them. The lobby of Caldwell Tower was a cathedral of glass and marble, polished to perfection. Every corner reflected order, discipline, and the relentless drive that had built Richard Caldwell's empire. For years, he had thrived on control. Every deal, every contract, every movement in his life orchestrated with precision. Yet in this moment, standing before a boy no taller than his waist, that control slipped through his fingers. Ethan's words, "Can you help my mom?" echoed in Richard's mind like a bell tolling in an empty hall. He wanted to dismiss it. He wanted to tell himself that it wasn't his responsibility, that charity was for foundations and public relations departments, not for him personally. His assistant, Margaret, stood rigidly by his side, clutching the day's folder of meetings and contracts. She leaned in and whispered, "Sir, we need to go. You'll be late for your call with Tokyo." Richard nodded slowly, trying to collect himself, but when he looked down at Ethan again, he felt something stir in his chest. The boy's eyes weren't demanding. They weren't manipulative. They were pleading, innocent, and far too old for a child his age. "What's your name?" Richard finally asked, his voice quieter than he intended. "Ethan," the boy said, clutching the straps of his worn-out backpack. His shoes were scuffed, his jeans a little too short, and his shirt hung loose as though it had once belonged to someone bigger. "Please, sir, my mom, she's sick. They won't help us at the hospital anymore." I didn't know who else to ask. Richard's jaw tightened. His logical mind fired back instantly. This could be a scam. A setup. People often fabricated stories, especially when they knew who he was. He'd been warned about it countless times. But even as his thoughts sharpened, something deeper pushed against his doubt. The desperation in Ethan's voice wasn't rehearsed. It was raw, trembling, and painfully real. He straightened his tie, struggling to regain composure. "There are services, charities, shelters," he muttered. "Why don't you go to one of them?" Ethan shook his head, his lip trembling. "We tried. They said we don't qualify. They keep saying we don't fit the rules." His small hands balled into fists. "I just want my mom to get better. Please, sir. You're the only one who looks like you can help." Richard turned his gaze toward the revolving doors of the tower. Outside, a car was already waiting to whisk him away to another meeting that would add more millions to his empire. The world of power, numbers, and control beckoned him forward. Yet behind him stood a child, a single voice that threatened to unravel the walls he had built to shield himself from messy, unpredictable humanity. For a moment, he closed his eyes. His mind tugged him one way, his heart another. What if he ignored the boy and walked away? Would Ethan's face haunt him in the quiet of his penthouse? Would he replay those eyes staring up at him, asking for something no balance sheet could calculate? Margaret spoke again, firmer this time. "Mr. Caldwell, we really must go." Richard opened his eyes, staring down at Ethan once more. He felt caught between two versions of himself, the titan of industry who couldn't afford to slow down, and the man, long buried, who once knew what it felt like to need help and have no one listen. For the first time in years, Richard felt truly conflicted. And in that tension, something inside him began to crack. For a long moment, the boardroom felt frozen in time. Richard sat stiff in his chair, his perfectly tailored suit a kind of armor that suddenly felt unbearably heavy. Ethan's words, "Can you help my mom?" still hung in the air like a haunting melody he couldn't shake. Around him, executives shuffled their papers, awkward coughs punctured the silence, and all eyes turned expectantly to him. Richard was the man with the answers, the one who never faltered. Yet now, faced with a trembling boy who should have been thinking about recess and cartoons, Richard felt something crack inside. He tried to push it away at first, tried to remind himself of the schedule, the shareholders waiting, the media campaign his assistant had been prepping. But no matter how hard he tried, his gaze kept drifting back to Ethan, thin arms clutching a worn backpack, sneakers scuffed, hair a little too long as if no one had the time or money for regular haircuts. The boy's presence was not polished or staged. It was raw, real, and unignorable. Richard's logical mind scrambled for an exit strategy. Maybe he could write a check, hand it off discreetly, and get back to business. That was what men like him did, throw money at problems, then step back into their world of glass towers and chauffeured cars. But something about Ethan's eyes stopped him. They weren't begging for charity. They were filled with something heavier, something that felt like a mirror of loneliness Richard hadn't let himself think about in years. He remembered his own childhood for the first time in decades, his father leaving, his mother working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. He remembered the hunger that gnawed at him at night, the humiliation of wearing the same worn-out shoes to school year after year. And suddenly, Richard wasn't looking at just a boy. He was looking at himself. The room blurred. The spreadsheets, the charts, the endless corporate talk, it all faded until there was only Ethan, standing small but unyielding, waiting for an answer. Richard's chest tightened. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, expecting him to dismiss this interruption. But for once, he didn't care about expectations. Richard leaned forward, clasped his hands together, and spoke in a voice that sounded almost foreign to him. Soft, human, stripped of the steel edge he usually wore. "Tell me about your mom," he said. Gasps rippled around the table. The executives glanced at each other in disbelief. This wasn't in the agenda. This wasn't Richard Caldwell, the untouchable CEO they knew. This was different. Ethan's lips quivered, and for a second, it looked like he might break down. But then he straightened his shoulders, as if his mother's strength was flowing through him. "She's sick," Ethan whispered. "She works so hard, but she can't anymore. And they said we might lose the house. I just thought maybe you could help." Richard felt the words like a blade through the heart. This was no PR stunt, no carefully crafted sob story. It was a plea, a son's desperate attempt to save his mother. For the first time in years, Richard made a decision not with his head, but with his heart. He turned to his assistant and said firmly, "Cancel the next meeting." The assistant blinked. "Sir." "You heard me," Richard repeated, his voice stronger now. "Clear my schedule. I'm taking care of this." The executives whispered in shock, but Richard didn't hear them. His focus was locked on Ethan, and in that instant, he knew his life had shifted. He wasn't just a CEO anymore. He was a man being called to step into something greater. The first time in decades, Richard didn't resist. Richard's car pulled up to a worn-down apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. The glass towers of downtown felt like another world compared to the peeling paint, cracked staircases, and flickering streetlights that greeted him here. It was a place he had never been before, a place far removed from the polished boardrooms where every surface gleamed with power. Ethan guided him nervously, clutching Richard's hand as though afraid he might change his mind and leave. His small frame seemed even more fragile under the dim hallway lights, his little shoes squeaking on the uneven floor. Richard noticed how his shoulders slumped, not in the way a carefree child should, but in the way of someone who had already been carrying too much. They reached a door with a dent in its middle, the paint chipped away. Ethan knocked softly. From inside came a weak voice. "Ethan? Is that you?" "Yes, Mom. I brought someone." The door creaked open. There she was, Maria, Ethan's mother. Thin, pale, her eyes tired but kind. She was beautiful once, that much was clear, but her beauty had been eroded by years of sacrifice, by nights of worry, by days of exhaustion. She leaned against the doorframe, her body frail, but her spirit, Richard noticed, still somehow unbroken. "Ma'am," Richard said awkwardly, removing his hand from his pocket, unsure how to greet her. In boardrooms, he was decisive, commanding. Here, he felt like a stranger fumbling for the right words. Maria gave a small smile. "You must be Mr. CEO. Ethan talks about people like you all the time, dreams about how life could be different if only." She trailed off, coughing, and covered her mouth. Richard stepped forward instinctively. "Are you okay?" Maria waved it off, trying to hide the weakness. "Just a little tired. Please, come in." The apartment was small, no bigger than one of Richard's guest bathrooms. A couch with fraying edges sat in the center, a single lamp glowing weakly beside it. On the counter, a stack of unpaid bills lay scattered, their red-letter warnings shouting louder than any words. Richard stood in silence, absorbing it all. The world he had built his empire in, stock reports, investments, polished presentations, suddenly felt shallow compared to this quiet reality. He noticed the medicine bottles on the table, the half-empty fridge humming faintly in the corner, and the blanket on the couch where Maria clearly slept, giving the only bedroom to Ethan. Maria gestured for him to sit, but Richard hesitated before lowering himself onto the couch. He could feel the springs pressing through the fabric. Ethan perched beside his mother, holding her hand tightly as though trying to shield her from everything. Richard cleared his throat. "Ethan told me about you. He asked for help." Maria's eyes glistened with both pride and shame. "He shouldn't have done that. We don't ask for charity. We get by, somehow." "But you're not getting by," Richard said quietly, his voice heavier than he intended. Silence hung in the room. The sound of a faucet dripping in the kitchen echoed like a metronome. Richard's chest tightened, because in this silence, he wasn't just seeing Maria. He was seeing his own mother from decades ago, struggling to raise him after his father walked out. He remembered the same dim rooms, the same unpaid bills, the same quiet despair. For the first time in years, Richard felt the walls of his carefully curated life cracking. Maria finally spoke. "Mr. Caldwell, you don't owe us anything. You're a busy man. I can't imagine why you'd even be here." Richard looked at her, then at Ethan, whose wide eyes searched his face for answers. And in that moment, Richard knew, he wasn't here out of obligation. He was here because fate, or God, or something bigger than him, had brought him to this exact doorway. He leaned forward, his tone soft but firm. You're right. I don't owe you anything. But maybe I've been owed this moment. Maybe I've been given everything I have so that I could finally do something that matters." Maria blinked, stunned by the weight in his voice. Ethan's small hand tightened around hers. And right then, Richard Caldwell, CEO, billionaire, untouchable in every boardroom, made a silent vow. He would not walk away. The journey had just begun. Richard thought it would be simple at first. He was a man used to making problems disappear with a stroke of a pen or a decisive order. When he left Maria's modest apartment after that first meeting, he told himself, "I'll have my assistant arrange the best doctors, I'll set up some funds, and that will be that." But nothing about this was that simple. The next morning, as his sleek black car rolled him toward the towering glass headquarters of his company, his mind kept drifting back to the sight of Maria's trembling hands gripping the armrest of her chair. He remembered Ethan standing there beside her, his tiny fingers protectively wrapped around hers. It wasn't just illness. It was years of hardship, years of slipping further behind, one bill after another crushing them. When he arrived at his office, Richard picked up the phone and called one of the most respected doctors in the city. The doctor owed him a favor, and Richard was ready to cash it in. But to his surprise, the doctor hesitated. "Richard," the voice said gently, "from what you've described, her condition isn't just a matter of treatment. She'll need long-term care, rehabilitation, consistent medication. This isn't a quick fix." Richard leaned back in his leather chair, frustration tightening his jaw. He wasn't used to problems he couldn't solve quickly. That night, he returned to Maria and Ethan's apartment with groceries, a gesture that felt both foreign and strangely humbling. Maria protested, embarrassed, but Richard insisted. When she tried to thank him, he shook his head. "Don't thank me yet," he muttered, almost to himself. Over the next weeks, Richard found himself juggling two worlds. By day, he was still the commanding CEO, dealing with board meetings, mergers, and endless charts of profits and losses. But by night, he found himself sitting at a rickety kitchen table in a cramped apartment, helping Ethan with homework while Maria rested on the couch. It wasn't easy. His board of directors noticed his distraction. His assistant whispered about his unusual absences. One night, an old friend confronted him at a private dinner. "What are you doing, Richard?" the man asked incredulously. "You're jeopardizing everything for what? Some woman you barely know? A kid who's not your responsibility?" Richard's fork froze midair. He wanted to say something dismissive, something to brush the whole matter aside. But the truth burned inside him. He couldn't walk away anymore. Meanwhile, Maria herself resisted. She was fiercely independent despite her frailty. "I don't want charity," she told him one evening, her eyes flashing with a pride that even sickness couldn't extinguish. "I've worked hard all my life. I don't want Ethan growing up thinking people have to save us." Her words cut Richard deeper than he expected. This wasn't about handing out money. It was about giving them back their dignity, their hope. So, Richard adjusted. He stopped offering solutions that looked like charity. Instead, he asked Maria what she needed most. Slowly, trust began to grow. The climb wasn't just Maria's fight against illness. It was Richard's fight against his own world, against the part of him that had always believed vulnerability was weakness, that people were responsible for their own struggles and nothing more. But now, sitting at that worn kitchen table, watching Ethan carefully color in his homework assignment while his mother's tired smile lingered in the background, Richard realized something. For the first time in years, he felt alive. The climb had begun. And though the challenges were steep, the cost of care, Maria's resistance, the disapproval of Richard's peers, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He couldn't turn back. Just when hope seemed within reach, life had one more cruel blow to deliver. The clinic had given Maria a fragile sense of stability. The medicine Richard had helped secure brought flickers of strength back to her frame. Ethan, for the first time in months, smiled more often, his eyes glowing with the innocent belief that things were finally turning around. Richard too allowed himself to feel a cautious optimism, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he was fixing what had once seemed broken beyond repair. But hope can be fragile, and fate often has a way of testing those who dare to embrace it. It began with a phone call. Richard was in his office, reviewing numbers for a major deal, when his assistant rushed in, her face pale, her hands trembling. "Mr. Caldwell," she whispered. "You need to take this. It's the hospital." Richard's stomach tightened instantly. He grabbed the phone, his voice sharp, almost desperate. Richard Caldwell speaking. On the other end, the words came in fragments, but each hit like a hammer. "Maria, complications, collapsed, emergency room, critical condition." The world seemed to tilt beneath him. For a man who lived by structure, control, and predictable outcomes, Richard was suddenly powerless. His papers, his deadlines, his empire, none of it mattered in that moment. He bolted out of the building, his driver barely able to keep up as Richard barked directions to the hospital. When he arrived, Ethan was already there, sitting small and broken in the waiting area, his knees drawn to his chest. His cheeks were wet, and when he saw Richard, he rushed forward. "They said she might not make it," Ethan choked out. "Please, Mr. Richard. Please don't let her die." Richard froze, Ethan's words slicing through him like the boy's first plea on the street. This time, however, the weight was unbearable, because now he cared. 4 hours, they waited outside the sterile double doors, every tick of the clock carving deeper into their hearts. Richard, a man who once measured time in profit margins and boardroom schedules, now found himself praying with a child, bargaining with a god he hadn't spoken to in years. Finally, the surgeon emerged, his expression grave. "Maria made it through surgery," he said softly, "but her body is weak. The infection spread further than we thought. We'll need more intensive care, and even then," he hesitated, "even then, there are no guarantees." Richard felt the floor threaten to give way beneath him. He had poured resources, time, and emotion into this fight, and yet, Maria's life still dangled by a thread. Ethan clung to his hand, whispering through tears, "Don't leave us now, please." That night, Richard sat alone in the dim hospital corridor, his head buried in his hands. He had always believed money could fix anything, that success was measured in numbers and contracts. But here was a battle money couldn't promise to win, and he was terrified of failing this boy who had given him something no balance sheet ever could, a sense of humanity. And so, Richard faced the darkest question of his journey. Would he have the strength to keep fighting when the odds seemed stacked against them all? The hospital room was bathed in an unforgiving white glow, the steady beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor slicing through the silence like a metronome counting down to an unknown end. Maria lay motionless, her chest rising shallowly beneath the thin hospital blanket, her skin pale, almost translucent. To anyone else, she might have looked like a patient suspended between life and death. But to Ethan, she was still Mom. And to Richard, she had become something unexpected, a mirror reflecting everything he'd lost touch with in himself. Doctors swarmed around her bed, their hushed words laced with urgency. "She's septic. We need to move her into surgery immediately." Ethan clung to Richard's hand, his small frame shaking violently. "Please don't let her die," he whispered, his voice breaking into sobs that pierced through the armored walls Richard had built over decades of corporate battles. In that moment, Richard realized no boardroom decision, no hostile takeover, no million-dollar negotiation had ever carried stakes like this. Maria's life wasn't just her own, it was Ethan's future, his anchor, his entire world. When the surgeons wheeled her away, Richard's carefully composed facade cracked. He stepped into the sterile hallway and felt his knees buckle. For the first time in years, he prayed. He didn't know the words, didn't know if anyone was listening, but the plea erupted from his chest raw and desperate. "Don't take her away from him. Don't take her away from me." Hours blurred into eternity. Richard sat slumped in the waiting room chair, Ethan curled against his side, both of them staring at the swinging doors that led to the operating theater. Every time a nurse walked by, Richard's heart lurched. Every shadow across the glass panel felt like a verdict being written. Inside him, something was unraveling. All his life, Richard had defined himself by control. Controlling numbers, controlling outcomes, controlling people. Yet here, in the most crucial moment, he was utterly powerless. And it was this very helplessness that began to free him. The surgeon finally emerged, sweat streaking his brow. Richard surged to his feet. Ethan's fingers tightened around his coat. The doctor's voice was steady but grave. "We managed to stabilize her. She's alive. But the next 24 hours are critical. She's still in danger." Tears Richard hadn't shed in decades slipped silently down his face. Relief crashed into him like a tidal wave, followed by a crushing weight of responsibility. This was no longer about charity or a fleeting act of kindness. This was about life, love, and the terrifying fragility of it all. As Richard walked back into Maria's room with Ethan, he looked at the fragile woman on the bed and felt his heart shift permanently. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about mergers, stock prices, or profit margins. He was thinking about second chances. Hers, Ethan's, and perhaps even his own. Standing by her bedside, Richard whispered to her unconscious form, "I don't know why fate put you in front of me, but I swear I'm not walking away. You're not fighting this alone. Neither of you are." And in that fragile, broken space, between life and death, between the past and what could still be, Richard discovered something he had lost long ago. Humanity. The morning sun broke through the blinds of the hospital room, casting golden light across Maria's face. For the first time in weeks, she looked at peace. Her breathing was steadier, her color stronger, her smile faint but full of life. Ethan sat beside her, his small hand wrapped tightly around hers, whispering stories about the puppy he wanted someday, about the house with a little garden he dreamed they would live in. And standing in the doorway, quietly watching, was Richard. But he wasn't the same man who had rushed past a boy on the street weeks before. His tailored suit felt less like armor now. His phone, once glued to his ear, was silent. In its place was something he hadn't felt in decades, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with boardrooms, numbers, or shareholders. Maria looked up and caught his gaze. Tears welled in her eyes. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice fragile but steady. Richard shook his head. "No," he said, stepping closer. "It was Ethan's love that saved you. I just finally listened." In that moment, the world seemed to pause. A mother, a son, and a man who had once thought he had everything, realized what true wealth really was. It wasn't in bank accounts, stocks, or corporate empires. It was in moments like this, where lives intersect in ways that change everyone forever. As Maria's strength returned, Richard found himself more and more drawn into their lives. He made sure they had a safe home, medical support, and the stability they deserved. But more than that, he gave something money couldn't buy: his presence. Richard began showing up for Ethan's school events, helping with homework, even joining them for quiet dinners where laughter replaced silence. The city never knew the full story. Headlines didn't capture it. But within those walls, 3 people became something unexpected. A family stitched together not by blood, but by compassion, sacrifice, and second chances. And Richard himself? He wasn't just a CEO anymore. He was a man reborn. The walls he had built around himself crumbled, replaced by something far more enduring: love. Now, as you hear this story, I want to leave you with this. Sometimes, the smallest voices carry the greatest truths. Ethan's simple words, "Can you help my mom?" didn't just save a life. They transformed one. So here's the question I'll leave you with today. In your own life, whose voice are you ignoring? Whose cry for help could be the very thing that unlocks your purpose? Because maybe, just maybe, your greatest wealth won't come from what you build for yourself, but from what you choose to build for someone else. If this story touched your heart, don't just keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs reminding of the power of love, compassion, and second chances. And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, subscribe, join our community, and let's keep spreading light in the darkest corners. Because sometimes, one act of kindness doesn't just change one life, it changes them all.